This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back, and we're going to talk about the 1995 movie Outbreak. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Raven Forrest Fruscalzo. Raven is a third-year PhD student at the University of Notre Dame and works in neurophysiology and behavior, and she works particularly with mosquitoes. She was an airman in the U.S. Air Force from 2002 to 2006, which is going to give her and give us a unique perspective on this movie that has so much involvement with the military. She is also the host of the Tiny Vampires podcast, where she takes questions from the public and answers them by translating the original science that answered the question into everyday speak, which I can't recommend that podcast enough. You should definitely check out her podcast, and more information will be in the show notes. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Thank you. It's been great. Yeah.
Just as a short introduction to this movie, the tagline of the movie is "Try to Remain Calm." Outbreak has an all-star cast. It features Dustin Hoffman, Morgan Freeman, and really the main point of the movie is what would happen if a deadly infectious disease like Ebola hit the United States. And that's what we're going to really focus in on today, is what would be the real reactions, and how would, and especially in 2017, how would the government react to that sort of event? Quickly, the production details, courtesy of IMDb and Wikipedia. The director was Wolfgang Petersen, a German director who's directed many action movies like Das Boot, In the Line of Fire, and Troy. So I think you're going to see that there's a lot of action in this movie. It was released in March of 1995, so it's going on about 25 years old now, which I didn't think really impacted the movie, that a movie was that old. Did you find that, at least did it seem dated to you?
No, it really didn't. It really didn't seem dated to me at all.
The movie had a $50 million budget and a $13 million opening weekend, with a runtime of 127 minutes, and it got surprisingly high ratings from a 60% Rotten Tomatoes and a 65% Metacritic, which is pretty respectable. It has a really high-powered cast for a disaster-type movie. It stars Dustin Hoffman as Colonel Sam Daniels. He needs no introduction. He's a multi-Academy Award winner. Then stars Renee Russo, who this is one of her real breakout roles in the early 90s. Morgan Freeman, another Academy Award winner. He probably has the greatest voice of all time. Then we have Donald Sutherland playing a general, as well as Morgan Freeman playing a general. He's a Canadian actor who's been the star of movies for almost 50 or 5 decades. Then some of the supporting cast, this is one of the first roles where they're really recognizable. Kevin Spacey plays a lieutenant colonel who's an assistant to Dustin Hoffman, as well as Cuba Gooding Jr. in one of his first roles, and then Patrick Dempsey, who has actually a bit role in this. He dies very early of the disease, and this is, again, one of his first roles. The movie starts off in a flashback scene where a small military base in the jungle of Africa, all the soldiers have been infected with a disease called Matamba, and 2 Army medical officers make a decision to drop a gigantic bomb on this camp to obliterate it and destroy the virus. We'll find out very shortly that those 2 young officers were Morgan Freeman and Donald Sutherland. We flash forward to the present, which is 1995, in a small village in the African country of Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a terrible virus has invaded the village. Several U.S. AMRID or US AMRID officers come to research and see what's happening. And then a sequence of events brings this virus back to the continental United States. And that's really what we're going to focus in on today, is how do these diseases, how can they transmit from far off places to a place like the United States? And then what would be the reaction of a country, a developed country like the United States? Now, Raven, can you just give us an overview on disease and your particular background and interests?
Yeah, sure. So I'm particularly interested in vector-borne diseases, which are things like the Zika virus has been in the news a lot, and other things that are carried by mosquitoes and ticks, things like Lyme disease. So infectious diseases are diseases that are transmitted to you. It's not something like cancer or a genetic condition. There has to be a pathogen that is introduced to you in some way. So infectious diseases are typically something like a parasite like malaria, a fungus like ringworm, a bacteria like Lyme, or even of course, we're talking about viruses today. And then there's even something called prions, which are just misfolded proteins, and they cause things like mad cow disease.
In that opening quote, the single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is the virus, and that's by Joshua Lederberg, a PhD and Nobel laureate. What do you think about that quote?
Gosh, it's hard to say. There's a lot of different infectious diseases that really have a big impact on societies. Malaria, which is actually a parasite, pretty much kills. Of the infectious diseases, it kills the most number of people. But we also have really big other threats that are coming from ourselves, like things like nuclear war. And so if you ask somebody that studies infectious disease, they'll kind of have a slight bias there, right?
Now, in that very opening scene, it's kind of a cool scene where the one general, they're asking for help, and he says, I'll immediately authorize an airdrop, which that airdrop is actually a gigantic bomb that destroys the village. Would that work to destroy a virus?
Yeah, it really depends on the virus. Some viruses infect animals as well as people, not to mention that it could infect the water supply. So typically something with a really high heat, like they showed this bomb as like a big fire bomb. So something with really high heat like that would denature the DNA or RNA of the virus. And then just afterwards, the virus would just be exposed to the environment. So the radiation from the sun and direct access to oxygen would also deactivate the virus. So with some viruses, it's just a matter of hours. Some viruses, it's actually as soon as it has contact with the air, it's deactivated. So it's kind of hard to generalize because viruses, there's so much variability in them.
The next scene in the movie flashes us back to the present, again, the mid-90s. And it's at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the U.S. AMRID facility is, or headquarters. And they have kind of a montage scene of people going through different biosafety levels. And they explain on a roll on the bottom what these different levels are. And they detail biosafety levels 1 to 4. What is that accurate, that measurement, and what might somebody typically see if they were going through those different levels?
Yeah, so the biosafety levels or biosafety labs, they're 1 through 4, they're a real thing. I've worked in BSL 1 and 2. So The movie mostly has these right with their explanations, with the exception of the fourth one. So all they put on there is no cures and no vaccines. There are many pathogens that are studied at lower levels that have no cures and no vaccines. For example, there's a lab that I worked in with the infectious stage of a parasite that causes Chagas disease. It has no cure and no vaccine, and it actually really has little means of treatment. But the difference is that the parasite would have to be at exactly the right stage to be infectious, and it also would have to come in contact with a mucous membrane or a wound. So it would actually, like a sharp would actually have to cut you in order for you to be infected. So this is highly unlikely to happen with the levels of protective equipment and the precautions that we use. So in BSL-4 is required to work with dangerous and exotic agents that pose a high risk to individuals, like aerosol transmission in laboratories, with infectious agents that are life-threatening or that we don't know if they're life-threatening or not, like if it was a brand new virus. So one of the interesting things that I noticed when I was watching the movies is that people were really just walking from lab to lab, and the doors were either left open or they really didn't have a lot of requirements to get in, with the exception of the 4 where they had to, like, were scanning their fingerprints. So just as an example of the level of detail that these labs are designed at, each lab actually has a negative pressure system where the air is pulled into the lab from the outside. So this way, if a pathogen gets out of any kind of containment that it's already in, then they wouldn't be pulled out by just the breeze that's caused by the door opening. So with a negative pressure system, it actually pulls the air in from outside. So in these scenes, there's a lot of different people wearing a lot of different protective equipment, but they're kind of all mixed together. You have somebody with gloves and masks standing right next to somebody who's just in their normal battle dress uniform. So this really doesn't make any sense, because if one person needs to be protected, the other people around them need to be protected too. And so there's I guess it's a lot more strict than and highly designed than they show, but definitely they got the levels pretty much right.
Would something like a level 4, would you find one of those like at your local university or something like that, or are these like top places like that the CDC would have, or the military?
Right, yeah, there's some universities that do have them, but it's really expensive to like install these systems, as you can imagine. So it's really uncommon. 1 and 2 are pretty common. Any kind of R1 university or kind of research first university that studies disease will typically have a 3, but level 4 is actually pretty rare.
Now, a little bit further into the movie, they actually go into this hot zone in Zaire, but now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they're in this village, and it's completely wiped out. Like, people are just dying everywhere. And they describe it as hemorrhagic fever. Is this a realistic portrayal of hemorrhagic fever? And what are some other examples of a hemorrhagic type disease or illness?
Yeah, so hemorrhagic is actually a series of symptoms. So it doesn't mean that it's like a particularly nasty family of viruses, but actually viruses that cause similar symptoms. So, for example, dengue, which is a mosquito-borne virus, is can become hemorrhagic in some people. So it's part of the family Flaviviridae, whereas Ebola, which is kind of the hemorrhagic fever that most people know of, is in the Filoviridae family. So it's really more of how the body reacts to the virus than a family of viruses. So hemorrhagic is from the same root word as hemorrhage. It means to bleed. So basically what these viruses are doing is they're making the blood vessels leaky. So a patient will, one of the first signs is that they'll bruise really easily because bruising is just bleeding under the skin. So they'll develop what looks like a rash on the skin, but it's actually thousands of tiny bruises just under the skin. So any area where there's a mucous membrane, like gums, eyes, inside of the nose, they start bleeding because that's where the skin is the thinnest. And so when you have those leaky blood vessels and really thin skin, so that ends up causing bleeding. So this is happening inside the body as well, which is why these diseases are associated with blood in the vomit and feces. The patients with hemorrhagic fever or hemorrhagic symptoms actually typically dies of shock because they're bleeding in so many places that their blood pressure falls to a level that just can't sustain their life. So in the movie they mentioned that this virus has a 100% fatality rate. So this is actually incredibly rare. Only a handful of viruses have a fatality rate this high, and it's only when the patients actually receive no treatment whatsoever. So for some context, HIV has a 100% fatality rate in situations where people are not treated. Rabies is at 99%, so it's actually one of the most dangerous viruses. And then Ebola in this most recent outbreak was at 60% fatality rate, but it's been as low as 25% and as high as 90%, just depending on the outbreak.
Two different viruses like HIV and Ebola, especially the Ebola type disease in this, where that type of Ebola kills somebody within a few days, but HIV, it takes a long time for the symptoms to show. And what's the difference going on between how these different viruses present themselves?
Right.
I guess you might say.
So HIV has kind of adapted to living in the human body. So if you think about it from a virus's perspective, they really, if they kill their host right away, they don't have a very long time to be transmitted onto another host, which is their ultimate goal is just like our goal is to reproduce and have successful children. So with HIV, it's adapted to living in people for longer so that it has this amount of time to be transmitted onto another person. Whereas Ebola is a pathogen of some other animal. So we don't know what animal it is right now. We know that it's in bats and is also in other than human primates, but we don't think that those animals are actually the primary host because it infects them and makes them sick as well. So in an animal that has adapted to the virus and the virus is adapted to them, a lot of times they don't have any symptoms at all. So when a human ends up with a virus that we're not adapted to and is not adapted to us, that's when it'll kill really quickly. So it all depends on how much time we've had to kind of interact and adapt to each other.
We can briefly here talk about the technology. Now, this is a movie that's approximately 25 years old, and some of the things are obvious, like the cell phones they use are gigantic, and the cars are a little bit old-fashioned. What about the science and scientific technology? How has that moved forward in the last 20 years? Have there been any major breakthroughs?
Yeah, we can diagnose viruses much quicker and much cheaper than we did in the 90s. Some of the things like when in one part of the movie she mentions an ELISA, which is an immunosorbent linked assay. Those things we're still doing, but we were actually way more efficient at it. In part of the movie, he mentions that that it'll take them just under a month to sequence the entire genome of this virus. Nowadays, we can diagnose based on a single strand of DNA using next generation sequencing, and we can learn a lot from the infectious disease just because we started viewing them in a different way. So before we really focused on the basics, just how a person caught the disease and how we could treat it. Now we look at pathogens as an organism that has a habitat. So at first glance, this kind of sounds silly, but I'll give you an example that kind of helps to explain it. So Lyme disease is transmitted to humans by ticks. These ticks feed on mice when they're in their larval stages. And so say you take your dog hiking and it picks up a tick. It brings the tick into the house and then the tick bites you. Knowing something like that mice do better during warmer winters and wet springs, like we've had recently, then we know that there's going to be more ticks. So knowing this whole system means that we know that if you treat your dog with tick medication, then you can actually keep yourself from getting sick. So getting a really broad overview of these whole systems can allow us to prevent diseases instead of just treating the ones that we already have, which I think we can all agree it's better to not get sick in the first place than to have really good medication.
Yeah, definitely. That brings us into an interesting thing that the movie brought up. There's sort of two stages to this where a monkey, I don't think they even say what specific type of monkey it was, seemed to have contracted the disease from the village, but he didn't have any symptoms. And then that monkey spread the disease to people. And then the next step after that is that the people began to spread it amongst each other. How does that whole thing of how do diseases spread from animals to people?
Yeah, so it's actually more common for a pathogen to be carried by other animals than not. So these diseases are called zoonotic diseases. So zoo is kind of like going to the zoo, means animals. So 60% of diseases are zoonotic, and of the emerging infectious diseases, there's 75% of them. So 75% of the new diseases that we're seeing are zoonotic diseases. There are diseases that we can get from our pets, like rabies, from farm animals, like mad cow disease, and from wild animals like ticks and mosquitoes, which carry Lyme and West Nile. So there's lots of different diseases and lots of different ways when people are interacting with animals, how we can actually contract them.
Then one other scene here that we'll talk about quickly in the vein of the technology is they analyze the genes of the virus and what is the science of isolating viruses?
Yeah, so like as I mentioned a little bit before, in the movie, I'm quoting Dustin Hoffman's character. He says, Casey put the bug into rodents and rhesus, and if everything goes well, we'll know the genetic sequence within a month. So thankfully these days it doesn't take months to sequence, and we're also using fewer experimental animals to do these things. A lot of it is because we're not starting from scratch. we know about other viruses that that we can compare them to. So a virologist could fit the virus into its family, and then they would know how to grow it more easily in culture, and using these methods, that they know about the related viruses. It might not seem like it to most people, but we've actually learned a great deal about the Zika virus in just the year that we've been researching it, because it's related to dengue and yellow fever. So other members of this family have given us hints at what to look at and how to look at it. So in this situation, because it was this brand new virus to them, they didn't really have anything necessarily to compare it to, or the modern day methods of comparing it. So their systems take a lot longer back then.
The next step in the movie is where we're seeing this monkey is infected, and he's been caught and sold into like the system of medical animals. That's what we assume, at least, that they're doing. How is the transportation of animals from areas that are known to have these sorts of infectious diseases? And then how stringent are the government screenings on this mass? I mean, a country like, say, the United States just has massive amounts of cargo. How can the government control these sort of things?
Yeah, the USDA and Customs are really the ones that control the transport of animals. I'm not really familiar with the specific laws and how they're enforced, because most of my experimental animals are, we have them here in our labs, and I know that transporting infected mosquitoes across border lines, there's kind of a process for that, but I'm not sure with like large mammals how all of that works. I can say, however, that animals used in laboratories are typically not purchased from the wild. They're bred from licensed facilities. So from kind of a really stringent scientific point of view, this makes sense, because research requires that you know everything about your animal, from how old it is to what it's been exposed to, what it's been eating, etc. So if a researcher is studying cognition in macaques, which is the most common research primate, they want to know if their experimental treatment is actually making a difference in the macaque's cognition. It's possible that, if they don't know how old the animal is, if the animal's 2 years younger than they thought it was, then, what they're expecting from its cognition is going to be different. So in the movie, they are actually, kind of, it appears as though they've gotten into the country legally, but then Jimbo steals the monkey and then is transporting it illegally. So the illegal animal trade is actually a really serious issue, and people are transmitting them as to sell them as pets or to sell them as food. And when these animals are smuggled, they're typically smuggled in really terrible conditions, and there's really no thought to what diseases they might carry. They're kind of just seen for their monetary gain. So it's always really important to know where your pet is coming from, no matter the species. And another kind of side note, as a biologist, you kind of tend to notice certain things. You mentioned that we didn't know what kind of monkey this was. So the monkey that they show in the movie is actually a South American monkey. They don't occur in Africa at all. Oh. And so it's funny. I started watching the movie, and it's one of the very first scenes. They show these monkeys crawling around on the trees in Africa, and I said, 5 seconds in, already first mistake.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Let's skip to the next part, because there's several steps in the movie where this disease has spread through, and ultimately this first case of Jimbo, who he's on a flight from California to Boston. And during the course of this plane, he just gets sicker and sicker. And then he winds up in the hospital. What are the capabilities of a major city hospital to deal with these types of unusual symptoms? Somebody shows up with just a set of symptoms. How would they deal with that?
Yeah, this isn't really my field. It's really more of a public health or medical doctor type issue, but I can tell you that the CDC has a list of diseases and symptoms that are what they call reportable. So they send out a list to all the hospitals and medical doctors as well as veterinarians, and if the doctor sees these conditions, they're required to contact the local public health department. So the epidemiologists that work at these departments and basically epidemiologists from all over the world, they're all sharing this information so that hospitals know what to keep an eye out for when it comes to like certain conditions. They're kind of keeping an eye out more than others. So oftentimes you'll hear about this in the news, like, there's a SARS outbreak, or, the CDC made an announcement about, Ebola or whatever condition. So the doctors are hearing about this long before we do. And so they're becoming aware and knowing to keep an eye out. So in the event that a disease is reported, it's often reported to the local public health authorities first, and they come in and confirm the diagnosis and then contact the state. So every state kind of has their own kind of version of the CDC, and so if they find that the condition is something that the CDC needs to know about, then they contact Atlanta, where the CDC is headquartered. So sometimes the local health authorities can handle it on their own. So if there's a restaurant where there's an outbreak of salmonella, then they have epidemiologists there that are qualified to kind of track that down and figure out the situation. So in other cases, the state has the capacity to take care of it. And then other times the federal government has to step in, like in the case of Zika in Florida, the federal government's funding a lot of the mosquito control.
So it is something that's fairly streamlined then?
I don't know how it actually works, like on a day-to-day basis, but that's how it's kind of designed to work. Oftentimes you kind of see the outline of something, but when you're working with it directly, you might see something different. So I don't really want to say exactly how it works, but this is kind of the idea behind it that I've heard from talking to like local public health authorities.
So at least by design,
yeah,
it's a
but it is the government
streamlined system. In this movie, Jimbo is sort of the first case of it, and almost immediately another person gets infected with the disease who was with Jimbo. And in the midst of him getting lab results, one of the lab technicians gets sprayed by a vial of blood or something. And he's actually the second person or the third person to get to the disease. He gets sick right away. And then they show a scene where he coughs and the cough spittle goes into the duct system and then everybody gets sprayed with it. So a disease that initially is through contact becomes airborne. How do viruses mutate, and how quickly do they mutate when they're passing between people?
Yeah, viruses are under selection pressure, just like living things are. So there's some disagreement in the biological world as to whether viruses are alive or not. So kind of dance around that subject. But just like living things, they have they have genes that they're trying to pass on to the next generation. Sometimes these viruses have genes that make them incredibly fast and deadly, and so they have to spread in a really short amount of time. And if the disease has milder symptoms, then they're going to be spreading, they have a longer amount of time to spread. So from the virus's perspective, lethality to your host is actually not a good thing. So some viruses mutate more quickly than others. So, for example, every single year we see a new strain of the flu, right? So that's why we have to get a new flu shot every year. But dengue, the dengue virus actually only has 4 strains that we currently know about. So the Mutava virus in the movie somehow magically manages to be transmitted in water between an animal and a human through saliva, between a human and human in saliva and in blood, and from a scratch from the infected animals, and then later through the air. So each of these modes actually requires, these modes of transmission actually require different genes that allow the virus to stay in the infectious stage through these different environments. So you can imagine staying alive in the water and staying alive in the air is very different than staying alive in saliva. So these mutations in viruses aren't like this. They don't happen all at once. And when it does gain these abilities, it's like, for example, to be transmitted through the air, it typically wouldn't be very good at it at first. So it would not be able to last very long in the air. So for example, if he was sitting right next to his girlfriend and coughed, then the virus would be able to last that long, but to be able to basically instantly spread to the entire movie theater is its first go round is pretty unlikely.
Now, almost immediately after that, once they figure out that they have this situation with the illness, the military sets up a containment. What is containment exactly, and how practical is containment, especially on a large scale, like even a small town that they put a quarantine around?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of experience with containment situations and procedures with these sorts of viruses, but currently we're seeing an outbreak of Zika in Puerto Rico and Florida and now in Texas. So in these situations, we're kind of watching how we're reacting to this outbreak in real time. So they're mostly controlling for the mosquitoes and making sure that anybody that is infected with the virus is constantly kept away from mosquitoes so they can't transmit it to the mosquito and then transmit it to another person that way. Another kind of a way for us to get an idea of how this works is if we look back to the Ebola outbreak in 2014. So during this outbreak, doctors were on the lookout for anyone with symptoms, like especially people that were coming from an outbreak zone. So they kept track of anyone, like once they were diagnosed, they kept track of anyone that had contact with these patients, and those people were quarantined. So Ebola is mostly transmitted through body fluids, so healthcare workers are the highest at risk. So there were actually 2 nurses that were caring for this Ebola patient that became sick. And they, because they were keeping track and they were keeping an eye on these people, they noticed the symptoms fairly quickly and were able to contain it that way. These containment situations are really kind of sticky situations for public health workers because they're under a lot of pressure, and we could see this during the Ebola outbreak, that they were under a lot of pressure not to infringe on these nurses' rights by confining them, and then other people felt that it wasn't far enough, that whole areas of travel needed to be there needed to be a travel ban for whole areas that had been affected by the Ebola virus. So it's kind of a constant balance for healthcare workers.
Yeah, I think like a movie like this and just in general, that's probably the stickiest situation. I mean, we're not lawyers here or civil rights attorneys, but there is such a strong balance between stopping a disease from spreading, but also preserving some sort of civil rights and that there are laws to the land. That sort of ethics must be something that comes up often in that sort of field.
Yeah, it's a pretty difficult topic to tackle. I think that having plans in place before an outbreak is really key, because making decisions when emotions are really high and people are sick is a really bad idea. Like when lawmakers are really when they don't have any stake in the game, and they're just concerned about keeping their citizens safe, then that's when it's time to actually make these decisions. Not when you're trying to react to a fast moving outbreak. So I can tell you that at Notre Dame, which is really the only institution that I've had experience with when it comes to this topic, ethics courses and discussions are really a high priority at this university, not only for public health workers, but also for scientists that are working with diseases and working with experimental animals. We're really constantly talking about the rights of individuals, the rights of other animals, and really how to best to keep these balances, make sure that we learn things, but also make sure that we're, treating life with dignity.
As this quarantine is progressing and getting stronger, and the situation as the drama of the movie's intensifying, the two general characters played by Morgan Freeman and Donald Sutherland talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic. Tell us this pandemic, what was the background of it, and how did that play out in learning about viruses, and really how did it add to our knowledge of how diseases spread?
Yeah, let's first talk about what the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic is. So a pandemic, like pan meaning all, is a disease that is affecting the whole world, while an epidemic is actually spread. It can be in a widespread area, but it's not typically the entire world. The 1918 flu was the worst pandemic that the world has ever seen. It killed more people than World War I, which it directly was directly after World War I, and like a lot of the soldiers were going from the battlefields and moving back to their countries. So it spread like wildfire because of this, because of these troop movements. So the other really devastating thing about it was that it killed mostly peoples in their 20s to 40s, which are mostly the people that are producing children. It was actually the healthier people, the people with the more vigorous immune systems, that were dying of this condition, and that's because their immune system was reacting to the virus in their lungs, and so that was causing their lungs to fill with fluid, and so they basically drowned. If we talk about the definition of a pandemic, it doesn't actually require that it be a really nasty, deadly pathogen. So we have actually a pandemic of flu every year, and this is as the virus moves around the world at a predictable rate. And so instead of calling it the flu pandemic, we call it flu season. And it's because, the mortality rate is actually not very high.
So those words, I think that they get used as sort of too generically, like epidemic, pandemic. They do have very specific meanings.
Right. And the term like outbreak and a lot of these words that are kind of used interchangeably have, in the epidemiology world, they have really specific definitions.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. And that use of definitions gets us towards the end, the final section of the movie, and where the drama is at its highest. They talk about trying to find this thing, this anti-serum. And to me, anti-serum sounds very like science fiction-y. Is that a term that you would use or scientists would use?
So serum, or also called anti-serum, is actually shorthand for getting the benefits of antibodies. So I'll explain a little bit of how what antibodies are and how we develop them. So when a pathogen enters our body, or really anything foreign to us, our body's immune system, the white blood cells and other immune cells, they're reacting to proteins and that are on the outside of these pathogens. So these proteins are kind of like the signature. So every single one of our cells in our bodies has our own signature. It's how our body recognizes our cells as our cells. So when this goes wrong, we end up with an autoimmune disease. Our immune system isn't recognizing our own cells and therefore attacking them. So when you have a pathogen, your immune system is seeing these the proteins on the outside of the pathogen and kind of seeing this signature. This is different than anything that I've encountered before. And so it creates these antibodies. So these antibodies are just little structures that kind of act like flags. They're dispersed throughout our system, and they're specific to this particular pathogen. So what a serum is a method of taking these antibodies that are produced by another animal and then cleaning them up and putting just the antibodies into a person. So it's kind of like jump-starting the system. Instead of the body having to learn what the pathogen is and then making these antibodies on its own and then using those antibodies to recognize and attack the pathogen, it's a shortcut. We just go straight to having these these little flags for the pathogen and letting the immune system recognize it.
The anti-serum, they finally find the host monkey, and they take him and they like shuffle him to the lab, and they're going to create that anti-serum. Would that work? Is that how things work? Like if you're already sick with something, do you get this anti-serum and boom, boom, you're good as new?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be really nice if vaccines or serums could actually be made this way, just by finding an asymptomatic carrier, or like this monkey wasn't sick, right? So asymptomatic is like it doesn't have any symptoms. So this would be really nice because there's actually a lot of viruses that either the animal or the person, they don't actually get sick from it. So if it were the case that we could do this, we'd already have a Zika vaccine, for example. So, for example, with Zika, it can infect people and they don't even know it. Most of the time this is true. Even something as bad as yellow fever, most of the people that get it don't actually realize that they've been infected. So they don't even feel sick. And then the people that do get sick, they might feel like they're just a bit under the weather, or they have a 24-hour bug. It's only a rare handful that actually really see these horrible effects from the pathogen. When they encounter the first monkey that they find in the pet shop, they say, "Oh, this monkey is sick, and therefore it won't have any antibodies." So based on what I've already explained, you know that if this monkey had an immune system at all, of course it would have antibodies because it was infected with the virus. Its immune system would be reacting to it. A lot of the symptoms that we're actually seeing are like fever are because the immune system is reacting to it. Monkey that was an asymptomatic carrier would have antibodies to the virus just like the monkey that was actually sick.
That's I mean, that definitely changes your perception of the movie for sure. One of the final scenes, we find out that really this whole thing with the containment and that the general wants to contain the town so that he can blow it up and then destroy the new form of the virus so that he still has the old form of the virus to use as a biological weapon. Now, obviously, like, biological weapons are illegal by many forms of treaties and that sort of thing. But tell us a little bit about using biology as a weapon. Is using biology a good weapon?
Yeah, so this is really one of the major flaws in the premise of the movie, is the general developing this virus as a biological weapon. It would actually be a really horrible biological weapon. They would have no way of keeping it from killing their own troops or our civilians. And, I mean, just like in this movie, it shows that they really had no control over it. So it couldn't be easily stored for a long time. They didn't have an effective means of dispersing it. So all of that being said is I would hope that our military wasn't developing any biological weapons, because like, as you mentioned, we've signed multiple agreements with a lot of different countries saying that we wouldn't develop them. And actually using them would be a war crime. But it's actually not illegal for us to study them as a means of defense. So if we suspect that another country is going to, say, be using anthrax, then it would actually be really irresponsible of us to not study anthrax and know how we could prevent our troops or our civilians from being impacted by these. So there are places that are studying biological weapons, but they're actually as a means of defending against them, not as a means of developing them.
Yeah, that, like you said, that trope of that warmongering general, you having experience in the military, you probably didn't see a lot of people who really wanted to fight wars and that sort of thing.
Right. So I can tell you, at least from the people that I have experience with, is that nobody that's actually been at war has actually lived through it. They really hate it. It's a horrible thing to live through, and so. The whole trope of military members that are just like love war and just want to, like in Jurassic Park, they wanted to turn dinosaurs into weapons, and I mean it's really we're trying to minimize casualties while at the same time protecting the freedoms of our own people. So. I mean, it's kind of similar to the public health situation, where it's really a delicate balance that every country is trying to find for themselves.
What are your final takeaways from the movie? I would say, as far as movie goes, I think it was a pretty decent movie. It holds the test of time, and it was action packed, and it did bring up some interesting points. Well, what did you think of it in the end?
Yeah, I think it was, a lot of movies, they're not going to, take the years to develop a serum or a vaccine. That doesn't really make for good television. The science kind of has to take a backseat to, the storytelling. And I think really what they were trying to get at was, thinking about these ethical issues of, where what are people's rights in these situations, and who's kind of best qualified to make these calls.
Well, I have to say this has been a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think I've learned a lot from it.
Yeah, it was really great and kind of fun and entertaining. Kind of not really tearing the movie apart, but looking at it in a really like analytical, kind of scientific sort of way, and kind of thinking about like what would the public feel about this. People that don't necessarily have like advanced scientific knowledge, how would they kind of perceive these things, and how can we kind of give them an idea of how things really work.
If people want to learn more about your podcast, Tiny Vampire, where can they find it?
Yeah, so it's on iTunes and Stitcher, and you can also find it on tinyvampires.com. And I also have a Facebook page where I try to post every day, like different news stories about what's going on in kind of the disease vector world, what's happening with Lyme, what's happening with Zika, a lot of these things that aren't really consistently in the nightly news, so people can kind of keep up with that.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Raven Forrest Fruscalzo of the Tiny Vampires podcast as well today. Links to learn more about Raven can be found at tinyvampires.com or in the show notes. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to the social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. We can talk about movies, and I would definitely like to hear your idea for show topics. Please share ideas for movies to cover, guests, or even different topics. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. As a side benefit, it also lets other people find out about the show. We'll see you next time beyond the big screen.